But the opposite could be true in the very short term, especially within a session. If you're trying to play around with, having an athlete experiment with a range of initial approach velocities. And those two relationships can simultaneously exist because they exist at different scales and contexts.
Sam likes biomechanics. Welcome to the Athletic Performance Podcast. Yeah, I'm honored to have you here, man. I know you got a busy schedule. We've been trying to work this out for a little bit as you kind of settle into your new job. But I think for people who are unfamiliar with your work and kind of your just career trajectory up to this point, just give me a quick backstory and kind of bring us up to speed on you.
So I actually did my undergraduate degree over in the UK. I did engineering science at Oxford. And I did not discover biomechanics as a potential pathway or subject until the third year of my undergraduate. And then I did a biomechanics-based master's, but was more so focusing on modeling how the foot moves as different healthy and clinical populations walk in turn. That's actually a huge area of research in the biomechanics field. But I really wanted to do more with sports. So that's where I came over to the States and did my PhD in biomedical engineering at Stevens Institute of Technology. And my dissertation was focusing on understanding the fundamental mechanics behind baseball pitching, as well as basketball running and jumping and dunking. I sort of came into this degree wanting to learn more about the jump technique, quote unquote. And my professor was like, we have this Major League Baseball grant research that somebody needs to do. And she's like, do you want to use it to get started? Because the training, the methods of data analysis are largely similar. And then I was like, yeah, I'm going to get a great exposure to, these kind of biomechanical research in the sports setting, and eventually develop my own research pathway during my PhD to study more dunking and jumping. So now I have a few publications for each of the topics.
Yeah, I think for guys on the outside, you don't realize how difficult it is to do performance-based research in a laboratory setting because there's just not a ton of money there.
Yeah, no, there's definitely no money for support. I tried to apply to a few research grants to support the efforts, and I'm currently 0 for 2. I made it to the finalist rounds for both, but didn't quite get the money at the end. And also there's other difficulties, like, for example, finding your participants. Generally, you're limited by the people you have access to. I have a great community on Instagram in terms of dunkers, so that's taken care of a lot of the participants in my studies. But yeah, the rest of my participants are really athletes from D3, so that limits you in terms of what you can infer from your results.
Yeah, for sure. I remember because when I was going through graduate school, I went to the university or Colorado State University. So, we had a really diverse professorship and research interest there. I mean, we had guys that were far, far on the spectrum of physiology, growing muscle cells in the laboratory. And then we had guys on the biomechanics end. And so I kind of found my way towards them because I'm like, this is probably the most sport adjacent thing that I could find. But you still have to kind of like almost tie it in with injury stuff. So we were doing jumping and asymmetries and tying that back, to ACL risk and stuff. But like that was as close as I could get at the time. So I'm a little jealous you got to look at dunking. But with that in mind, man, I do want to start at the top and talk about jumping. And the biomechanics stuff is coming more and more into the private sector. Guys are getting force plates. And so I think just having a fundamental understanding of some of the biomechanical and physiologic principles that really underpin performance is huge for a lot of guys. And so let's just start at the top. What would you clarify as the determinants of maximizing your vert? And then moreover, what does this actually mean to like the 16-year-old athletes we're training or the coaches who are working with them?
So I'm going to tackle this from two perspectives. From the physics perspective, it's actually remarkably simple. The projectile equation is pretty much the only equation you need, and it's about maximizing your upward velocity at takeoff. or some people will call it takeoff velocity.
Yep.
And in order to maximize that variable, you need to find a movement technique that allows you to have not only an advantageous initial condition or your initial velocity, as well as maximizing your force generation during the jump, during the ground contact. And that's basically what people often refer to as vertical impulse, which is the summation of the force you generate over a duration. So basically, to jump as high as you can, from a physics perspective, you want to maximize your vertical impulse, and you want to have a good initial condition, which is the result of your running approach. From a training perspective, it's slightly different because we have to treat the human as a complex system that sort of develops over time. So for a young athlete, it's really about doing the specific practice enough to develop your own movement patterns. And then you can either experiment with different jump technique modifications through like very specific drills and cues, or just practicing a variety of jumps, because I still believe in the variability of practice, which allows you to naturally find your own technique. Whichever side you take on that continuum of specific drills versus variability and constraint-based approaches, it's about exposing your body to generally the better way to jump, generally the better way to generate more force. And then you also need to develop yourself physically to be able to generate high forces at each of the major lower limb joints and build sufficient muscle tissues to stay healthy to allow you to practice enough over the long term. So that is the what I think are the major determinants. The other things are sort of icing on top.
Okay. So you talk about these initial conditions. Most of the assessments that we're using are going to be the static, hands on hips jump. What information is useful from that, and what is really missing when we're looking at an approach jump, which would be more practical to a sports setting?
Yeah, I actually think, there are research done that found some correlation in, counter movement jump performance as against running jump performance. I actually cited that paper quite a lot. But I think it only tells you that you're generally a good jumper. Because the tasks are very different, the task demands on the body are also very different. Your movement strategies between the tasks are likely very different. And I think the better of a running jumper you are, the more different it's going to look from your counter movement jump movement patterns and strategies. So I like counter movement jumps for other aspects of performance. For example, it's actually great for monitoring fatigue, especially if you want to track, the more details of how you jump as opposed to just the jump height itself. I think it's fine to track yourself and you track your general ability to handle eccentric forces, even though that specific task is a little bit too limited. You need to play around with different kinds of jumps on the force plate to understand your eccentric capabilities. But in terms of very specific transfer, I don't believe there's a lot of similarities between a running jump and a stationary jump. It's best to just look at how the athlete in front of you is doing a running jump if you're curious about running jump performance.
Yeah. So with that running jump, how much does the approach velocity compared to this ability to handle these eccentric forces modify that performance? Or do you see, I guess what I mean to ask is, do you see that elite jumpers can handle more approach velocity, or is there kind of a strategy dependent solution that these athletes are using that might differ among good jumpers?
No, that's a great question, actually, because this sort of touches on some of the approaches that you could do statistically. Obviously, I'm not going to go too deep into that.
Yeah.
But basically, there are trends that are generally good on a population level. If you list every basketball athlete ever that's tried to go up for a dunk, you're going to see a trend that higher jumping athletes usually come in with more speed.
Okay.
So that is the general trend, and it's a fine baseline guideline to tell you in which direction you should try to take your training to. Now, for an individual athlete's development over time, I think eventually you will end up using more and more approach velocity as your eccentric capabilities, as you mentioned, goes up, as your technique becomes better suited to handle more initial approach velocity. But in the very short term, having too much approach velocity can exceed your ability to control it. it will actually make you jump lower. So there's this general trend at the population level and over a very long time that sort of tells you that more velocity is good, but the opposite could be true in the very short term, especially within a session. If you're trying to play around with having an athlete experiment with a range of initial approach velocities, and those two relationships can simultaneously exist because they exist at different scales and contexts.
Okay. I got a follow-up question to this. I know I'm already throwing you some curveballs, like one question in. So in our setting, when we're watching athletes go into an approach, we're looking at something, say, I want to monitor hip height management, meaning I don't want my athletes to drop their center of mass too quickly. So with respect to these elite jumpers, one of the things I know that they're doing well is their time to takeoff is pretty quick. We would quantify this as explosive force, or they're able to apply these very, very large forces in very short time frames. Yet on the flip side, we're talking about applying force over time to create this impulse. So my question is, when we're trying to apply this large magnitude of force in very short time frames, are there certain biomechanical configurations like joint angles, things like that really help athletes do this? Or do we start to look at some of the physiologic characteristics of their strength, their eccentric force producing capabilities? Are those the things that actually modify this force producing potential?
No, another great question. Actually, I'm loving where these are going. So I think those things are intrinsically intertwined, right? Your physiological capabilities determines how well you're able to generate force against the ground, which is your biomechanics. So I actually kind of want to touch on the impulse and time idea. I think it's actually a big misconception in how people apply this impulse definition and impulse relationship. So the way impulse is often communicated by a lot of coaches is that it's force multiplied by time, right? That's generally the definition. But what really determines your jump height and your takeoff velocity, and what really matters in vertical jump, is your net impulse. And net impulse in the physics term is the sum of all of your impulse applied, which means it includes your body weight and your force that you apply against the ground. You want to apply maximum force that exceeds your body weight, and you want to do that for as long as possible. But you can't physically do that as long as possible because you can only generate forces that exceed your own body weight, as you mentioned, from certain joint configurations, right? So that's sort of the idea of having a lower minimum vertical position, aka more squatted, more flexed over position at the bottom of the jump. This is where that could be helpful because it gives you more time to generate more force that exceeds your body weight. It's not about generating very low force over a long time. That's not a viable strategy. You have to beat your body weight. You have to beat gravity in order for you to jump higher. That's why it's more important It's more important to train your ability to generate high forces as opposed to play around other things with time. It's also a lot more modifiable, right? You get stronger in your lower limb joints across a variety of exercises. You're going to have a higher likelihood of being able to generate more force that way.
No, that makes sense. I work mostly with developing athletes, so getting them stronger is kind of the first stop, right? Like, I always say, you don't put a spoiler on a Prius. Like, we want a car with a bigger engine before we start fine tuning and modifying that. And I think a lot of coaches have used this analogy, so it's nothing new. But I'm always in the back of my mind considering this constraint of time, right? Because even if I generate high forces, if I'm taking, a tenth of a second longer, which doesn't sound like much, like I might not be at the apex of my jump when I need to snatch that rebound, and somebody else might grab that. So how flexible is this time variable when it comes to applying forces above body weight? I mean, what is the range that you're seeing for, these elite jumpers?
Well, sadly, I don't have access to elite jumpers data, but just from first principles, generally, the shorter the better, especially if you add in the constraints of time. And there's also a thing where, in the example of grabbing a rebound, you might actually trade off between your maximum jump height versus your time to get off the ground. There's
Mm-hmm.
this flexibility and trade-off between, force application and time, such that it needs to just satisfy the task demand at hand, right? When you grab a rebound, okay, I'm also making a different argument in basketball because I've been a basketball player. If you need
Yeah.
to jump that high to grab a rebound, you did not box out well. So do your
Yeah.
work on the ground, right? And you might not need all of your maximum jumping capabilities. But the idea is for different tasks in different contexts, you're going to have different movement strategies. Your body finds the best way to trade off. And to me, from a training perspective, the best way to target those is to target the different ends of the spectrum, right? I know it's a controversial topic to talk about surfing the curve,
Mm-hmm.
but just from strictly maximizing your training stimuli in like the different extremes, you want to go to the extremes. So, if you want to play with speed, jump as fast as you can off the ground in a variety of contexts, and you end up being able to do it when the game comes. And also box out.
Also box out. I think that
Also box out.
immediately, soon as the shot goes up. Oh man, I coach some teams, and that is like the one thing I don't know why at the youth level they just that those eyes just go to the ball and they're just waiting.
Yep.
You kind of already answered this, but I don't know. It was one of the videos I watched of you or a previous podcast, but you talked about your framework centering on the mechanical objectives of any movement or sporting action, which is just I think a great foundational starting point. So for a young athlete, should we encourage them to seek, mimic, or emulate, what elite technique looks like? Or is there a better starting point?
So I actually used to think you should not try to copy techniques of athletes with clearly very different physical capabilities than you.
Mm-hmm.
But now actually I've changed my mind a little bit. I think
Okay.
for the youth athlete's perspective, there's nothing wrong in trying to mimic and emulate different techniques. If anything, it's a good exposure for you to move slightly differently and just see what it feels like. I think it's actually valuable in terms of your development, just because, again, of the movement variability. But I do think it's important not to be fixated on looking that specific way over your performance. It could be a fun thing to experiment with, like who hasn't gone out there and try a basketball move on the court, after you saw on the NBA, right? You all
Mm-hmm.
try it. It's a great fun. It's a great way for you to develop body control, but you shouldn't feel dejected if you don't look exactly the same. You can try it, but do not judge your technique through how it looks. You should judge it through how it performs, especially if you're already actively engaging, in the same sport. I think it's actually much more important for coaches and researchers to understand this mechanical objective perspective when it comes to movement technique. And also, I can sort of go into, the biggest strengths and benefits of viewing movements this way a bit later.
Mm-hmm.
But it's very important to keep in mind the mechanical objectives of the task if you're studying more sport-specific movements that goes beyond just your regular counter-movement jumps, etc. Because in
Right.
sports, you have the task at hand. You also have things like perception action, reacting to defenders. You also
Mm-hmm.
have environmental factors and other stuff. So
Yeah.
I think it's more important for coaches to know this, to understand this mechanical objective perspective.
No, I think that's great because I mean, when I was on the come up, I was a big NBA guy, and we used to go to this like half court you could rent, and we would do low rim dunks, trying to basically recreate everything Vince Carter did on probably like a 7.5 foot rim, when I was like 10. But I think the body control piece is way understated. Just knowing where you are in space. This is kind of more on my end of the spectrum in terms of application, but if we kind of anchor this mechanical objective first, what is the progression in the practice, or what should it look like for a young athlete?
Yes, so I think I'll first start by explaining what this mechanical objective perspective is. And this sort of
Mm-hmm.
I know ties into a later question on the impulse momentum relationship because they are
Yeah.
all very closely related.
Okay.
So the mechanical objectives are basically the minimum requirements in order for you to successfully complete a task. So I'll give a variety of examples so people can have a general idea.
Mm-hmm.
So in jumping, the minimum requirement for you to complete the task is to generate enough force to defeat gravity and allow you to be airborne. Any technique that allows you to do that technically is a successful technique. Obviously, there are some that's more successful than the others, but any technique is successful. Additionally, I'll give you more examples.
Yeah.
In our lab, we like to study, besides my exciting research, there's also other less, I'm just kidding, equally important, but maybe less exciting research, such as
Yes.
older adults walking and turning and balance.
Mm-hmm.
So in their case, their mechanical objective is walking straight, redirecting your body's momentum and orientation, get to your destination without falling. That's their mechanical objective. In a squat example, you want to squat down with a rate and then generate enough vertical force to stand back up. That is the mechanical objective. And again, in those, you want to maintain balance and not fall over. So mechanical objectives tells you, what are the basic requirements for this task to be successfully completed. And it does not care about how you are doing it. When you explore, when you view things from that perspective, you'll realize there are many different movement techniques that can work for different individuals. So this is when it sort of encompasses people categorizing different athletes, elastic power,
Yep.
wide, narrow ASA. And also it tells you what factors are more important in movement. Because mechanical objectives are usually about how you regulate the body's momentum. Momentum is controlled by forces. It's not controlled by how you look and what positions you hit. It's controlled by what kind of forces you can generate using different positions and using different limb and body configurations. So it's like a very over-encompassing framework when it comes to analyzing movement. When it comes to applying it to athletes, it tells you what factors are important versus not. For example, in jumping, you want to frame your jump technique development around things that will help you generate as much force as possible and things that will prevent you from having too much of a downward crash, right? People talk about hip height management. It's really talking about managing your initial downward velocity, and you can use some of it to generate more force through the stretch filling cycle, but it's only up to a certain point. It tells you like which of the diets you can play with, and instead of focusing on, this is where your arm should be at this time point, you can look at the bigger rocks, I think, the more important stuff. And it's less specific, but it gives room for the athlete to figure out through experimentation and practice. So I'll stop there.
Okay, there's a lot to unpack here. So I'm trying to digest all this. One area that you talked about was this categorization of athletes, because I think conceptually it's easy to decide what interventions might be relevant to improve these mechanical requirements or minimum necessary capabilities that we need to get, right? Defeating gravity. So you mentioned like the elastic versus the muscular athletes. Very common one that we understand. People that are more into like the I would say nerdy biomechanics might talk about these wide versus narrow ISA, and that can go down a deep, deep rabbit hole. But my question to you with respect to this mechanical perspective and the objectives required, how much of this categorization that we're using is actually useful shorthand for coaches? And how much is just kind of maybe oversimplifying complex mechanics?
The thing is, I don't think there's enough data for me to say if they're oversimplifying it or overcomplicating it, because there just has not been, any research to back any of these up.
Okay.
I actually had a lot stronger takes about whether you should use these categorizations at all, but I've sort of grown more peaceful over the years. I think I acknowledge that it is a useful way for coaches to respect individual differences. At the minimum, it's a way for people to move on from treating everybody the same way, giving everybody the same prescription. It's a useful tool to help you understand, different people move differently because the mechanical objectives of the task allows you to move in a variety of ways.
Okay.
It's actually also a general trend in a lot of research and practical settings. where we are moving away from like the general population or what we call group level, where
Right.
we're treating everybody as like, everybody as one data point that moves the same way. We're going into more looking at individual trends. But I do not think there's enough evidence to support the rationale, the explanations behind, here's why a muscular or elastic jumper should move this way, should train that way. I don't agree with the rationale, and I just don't think there's strong enough evidence to support them. You can use it as a tool to say they move differently, but I don't necessarily think you can fully justify treating their training completely differently. You should still examine how they respond to the training stimulus that you apply, and obviously pick the tool that's best for the job, right? If a categorization of a muscular versus elastic helps you make better exercise prescriptions, then feel free to use it. I have nothing against it. I just don't believe in the way people explain it because it doesn't make too much sense for me, and also I don't see strong enough evidence to support those rationales. But I think that's also for the most nerdy people. For application, you can do the right thing for the wrong reasons, and that's okay.
Yeah, which I mean, sometimes we fall into dumb luck. When we're looking at jumps, speaking of like an individual level, so I know some of in your research when you're doing the running jumps, how much variability was there on an individual level between these jumps? So they did 4 or 5 jumps. I can't remember exactly how many you were able to calculate, but what does that look like? Because it's easy to look at the tables and the charts and to get these averages either at a population level or at an individual level, but within a specific series of jumps, like what kind of variance are we seeing?
I'm actually seeing because these jumps are very well practiced. So the way actually we would describe this in research is that we are researching movements that are well practiced, goal-oriented tasks.
Okay.
In that sense, people perform it in a very specific and reliable way. So within the same person, across repetitions, there's actually not that much variability because they've done these kind of jumps enough times. I'm also seeing I'm seeing a pretty good amount of consistency across individuals in how they generate forces against the ground. Like I call it the impulse generation strategies, which is like how much force generation you distribute between your plant leg or the block leg, or as I call it in my paper, your first and the second leg in terms of what contacts the ground first versus second. So in that sense, there's actually the sample is what we call quite homogeneous. Everybody behaving fairly similarly when they are generating vertical forces. Now, when it comes to generating horizontal forces or braking against your forward momentum, we notice a lot more participant variation. And that's because you can brake more with your plant leg, you can brake more with your block leg. As long as you generate enough more forces, you're fine. The reason we are seeing more homogeneity in the vertical force is because as you contact the ground with your plant leg or the first leg, you're already generating a lot of vertical forces already. So it's just the nature of when you do this 1-2 sequence, your first leg's just going to generate more vertical force because it's being with the ground longer. Okay. So those are like some quirks of, yes, there are individual differences, but I don't think it matters as much. It's about whether you can fulfill the task at hand, which is controlling your horizontal velocity. As long as that's done, we're good to go.
Okay. Kind of on this note, obviously with a one-leg jumper, we're not going to have plant block leg. So can you just riff some of the differences in strategy or maybe advantages, disadvantages when it comes to, using 1 versus 2 legs?
From what I'm seeing from research, I know there's been actually there's been a few papers, like 2, that compares 1-foot and 2-foot jumps. But generally, the sense is 1-foot jumping is a lot more restrictive in the kind of movement strategies you could use. In 2-foot, if you consider, spending longer time versus shorter time, you have like almost 4 combinations, right? You can have either legs spending longer or shorter times with different movement strategies. But for 1-foot jumping, it's a lot more constrained. It places a lot higher of a demand on your lower limb joints. It's actually quite difficult to maintain balance as you run in with greater and greater speed. So it is straight up a tougher way of jumping, even though, for some people they say, oh, I can never figure out 2-foot jumping. Well, that's because you don't practice it enough. But I think at the highest level, 1-foot jumping, it's just more mechanically difficult. I think there's also just less movement variability in 1-foot jumping, especially successful 1-foot jumpers compared to 2-foot jumpers. You see a lot more technique variation when it comes to 2-foot jumping.
Yeah. Have you tested like performance, like outcome, 1 versus 2?
It's actually very difficult to do that research because if you're really good at 1-foot jumping, you're gonna just jump a lot more off your 1 compared to off 2, right?
Yeah.
You could have someone that theoretically could hit a higher 2-foot jumping, but they just haven't practiced it enough at the time of data collection. So it's a very difficult study to run. Theoretically, from a first principles perspective, I think you're likely to jump higher with the absolute height of 2 feet just because you can distribute the forces across both legs, and then you won't get as close to the maximum tolerable, tissue forces compared to 1 foot, where you do get quite close in how much your lower limb tissues can tolerate those forces. In 2, you can distribute the loads and therefore allows to generate greater forces theoretically than if you just only have 1 leg. It's like you have both legs on the ground to both generate forces. So
yeah, just kind of thinking out loud here, but it would seem to me that if I'm jumping off 1 leg, I'm not going to get the same level of change in my center of mass, at its minimum height. Like, so does that leg, is it just a more rigid strut that they're kind of using that momentum to some degree? I mean, it just seems like you wouldn't have the ability to almost like, I always think of it like going up a half pipe, right? We've got all this momentum coming in and we want to redirect as vertical as possible. But with 1 leg, that is really insanely difficult to do. So I just feel like they're passing over with, straighter joint angles. Am I wrong here?
No, that's actually a very, very, very great point, and one huge distinguishing factor between 1 foot and 2 foot. In 2 foot, you see a lot more of the descent of your center of mass. In 1 foot, that's actually discouraged. And there is like one paper done by Jesus de Pina, who's like one of the OG biomechanics researchers in the high jump space. He basically stated that you do not want too much of a vertical center mass descent after ground contact. But as you mentioned before, having this bigger vertical range of motion for your body is generally advantageous for jump height. And high jumpers achieve that through a combination of a backward lean as well as running a curve. So it allows you, you're able to lean backwards and lean into the curve, and that's one way they're getting some center mass descent as they go into the plant. But they definitely cannot afford to, have too much lower limb joint flexions just because of the demands on the lower limb.
Yeah.
So yes,
you're not going to see a basketball guy lean back like that, though.
Absolutely not. And also, you don't need to jump that high of 1 compared to the elite world-class high jumpers. Yeah. I actually think the high jump rules that only allow you to jump off 1 foot I think it's dumb. I don't care about traditions. I think if you define a task, I want you to define it as simply as possible. I don't want you to specify anything about technique. Just define the task and let the athletes figure out what's the best way to fulfill the task. Jump over the bar, done. That's it. As high as possible. Don't care how you do it. Just do it.
I think that's great.
We can only dream.
One day we'll start our own event. Okay, other constraints. So 1 versus 2, ball in hand. How does that modify the jump? I've heard you talk before. Like, obviously, if we're gonna posterize somebody, we've got to reach our apex before the rim. So we're jumping from a little bit further away. We're still going to have some forward momentum in the jump versus just jumping up and reaching a target. But what do we know about how this is actually modifying the strategy of jumping?
No, I love talking about this topic. It was so difficult to research this, actually.
Oh, I can't even imagine. I mean, how do you control for that?
Before my research, I have like one paper. It's like the most complicated paper I've ever written. That was like the only one that compares jumping with and without the ball in a running jump setting in like 21 people. So Basically, there were a huge variety of individual differences as expected because different people have different skill levels and how they jump with and without the ball. The way I did the research was I have them come in, obviously do all your warm-ups, you attach your sensors, and I just randomize the order of jumping with and without the ball. So, they might have like 3 trials without the ball, 2 trials with the ball, etc., until they have like at least 3 each with good enough data that I could analyze later on. So that's sort of how you can control it. You just randomize the order, and you sort of assume that, yes, there's going to be some crossover in the way they move, but because the tasks are different, you're just trying to observe movement differences between the tasks. There are certain statistical things you can do to control for that, interdependency. We call it like dependent trials, where they somewhat relate to each other, but are also different enough. So basically, all the individuals perceive that jumping with the ball is a more demanding task. If you're a basketball player, you know that's true. But there are some people that generates less force when they jump with the ball.
Okay.
There are some that modifies how they run in, which means they have more of a downward center mass crash. There are some people that do not modify either conditions, and they actually jump the same. So basically, you do not want to, but okay, so in terms of like all the different things that could be changed, the most common is people just generate the less vertical force. It could be because their plant legs force is lower or the block leg force is lower, but beyond that, we cannot really say what the causes are.
Okay.
But we could say, as you jump with the ball, maybe you need to put more active attention into really putting the force into the ground or driving up with your arms, right? We might need to be more intentional in our specific practice with the ball because there's this additional cognitive demand of holding the ball.
Okay.
We also don't want to change our running approach too much between jumps with and without the ball. I know when people dribble with the basketball, their posture changes compared to how they would just run normally. So being more mindful of that is also important. And the conclusion of that paper is really, these tasks are different enough even in these groups of skilled basketball players. So we should probably practice dunking and jumping with the ball specifically in addition to running and jumping without the ball. And if your goal is to be a great basketball player, honestly, you should just practice majority with the ball, right? You can do it off a lob where it also allows you to train a different aspect of a dunking specific skill, which is also good because it teaches you timing, teaches you how to look up and find a target, and actually is a great tool for teaching you better touch as your hand interacts with the ball during the air. So, yes, they are very different, I think.
Okay. This, to me, highlights a bigger issue when looking at jumping. So we do this on the force place as well, right? Counter movement jump with the arms versus without. So when I have a ball in hand, obviously the contribution of my arms to the jump is going to change. Now, historically, I think what we've been told is when you do an arm swing, right, you're getting more downward velocity, which you have to overcome, buys you a little more time to push against the ground so we can have that force above body weight, increase our propulsive net impulse. I guess, before we even talk about specific with the ball, but what is the role of the arms in jumping? Is that classical interpretation that I talked about still accurate? And I guess, does the ball really modify our ability to use that? Is that why potentially that vertical ground reaction force goes down? I know we're getting into the weeds here. I'm sorry, man.
Oh,
but
no, I love it. I've dug in. I've literally spent like years looking into papers that it's actually one of strength and conditioning research's favorite comparisons.
Yeah.
It's the classic counter movement jump with arms without arms. And it's actually one of the driving forces behind like my hypothesis for the Bonobo paper. Obviously in Bonobo, it's a suppressed arm swing, as I call it, versus complete elimination of the arm swing. So there's this one paper in 2004 by Adrian Lees, who's from the UK. He does a lot of track and field and jumping-based research. And the paper basically aims to causally understand why jumping with arm swing helps you to jump higher. So there's a few rationales that was stated in that 2004 paper. Number one, as you mentioned, is the vertical range of the center of mass. As your arms is straight at the very bottom and overhead at the very top, it gives your whole body center mass, more vertical range of motion to move through. And therefore, that's what you were talking about with the time, right? You have more time to do propulsive impulse, and that is entirely accurate. But then that paper tries to get into how the arms momentum is exerting a force onto the shoulder girdle, which accelerates your trunk upward. I don't know. I'm not sure about that.
Okay.
But it's a very confusing aspect. And obviously, if you have different papers with different groups of athletes doing the same test, you're going to have different explanations for, is it the average force that's modified? Oh, is it the duration of propulsive impulse that's modified? Both occurred, but it seems like it's the propulsive impulse generation duration, the timepiece, in like three of the four papers. That's like the only factor that's different. In one paper that looked at it in the volleyball players, it found that both average force and the propulsive impulse duration were changed. So, then we can sort of assume, both can be modified. We don't exactly know how in the lower limb joints. I think you need to probably, measure lower limb muscle activation patterns that you have to model for the, the lower limb joint forces and moments. But again, this is a point where I don't think understanding the full mechanism matters as much as just understanding what is the broad biomechanical differences and how it impacts the way we use CMJs as a testing tool.
Okay, I think there's value in that. So, I guess a follow-up question is: you kind of started to go down this, so I just want to kind of nudge it a little bit more. Even though you said you're more a man of peace now, but where do you see coaches kind of misapply physics in the weight room or on the court or jump training? And, how does this kind of impulse momentum framework keep us honest?
Yeah, well, there's a few things. I think people often oversimplify, which, it's a paradoxical statement, because I think the physics that govern jumping is quite simple. But people tend to oversimplify the impulse-momentum relationship. Like the example I gave with time, right?
Yeah.
People sometimes say, oh, you want to maximize time, you want to minimize time, etc. And then that's a seemingly paradoxical statement. It's because the full context is missing, where it's time when you're beating gravity.
Yeah.
So those are really the full context being missing to me is when it's most being misapplied. But other than that, I think people generally actually just tend to stay away from these mechanics concepts. I know only a few groups of people that really tries to get into the impulse stuff, where they're saying, oh, you need to maximize the duration of braking impulse, for example, but then they do not really define what is braking impulse. Are you braking in the vertical direction or braking in the horizontal direction? During a 2-foot running jump, you are doing horizontal braking throughout the entirety of the jump, but you're only doing vertical braking during the initial center mass descent phase, right? Really not fully understanding the concepts and fully communicating it when they are trying to make posts about it. That's to me when I will make a response post, because I'm like, it takes an extra 5 seconds to lay out the full context.
Right.
But I think it's not really you trying to actively deceive. It might be a understanding problem, which is totally okay, because instead of earning money, I was spending 5 years doing a PhD. So that's sort of how it is.
Well, I think part of it too is, we talked about the commercially available force plates. They're not looking at the horizontal components.
Yes.
Which are huge, especially if we're talking about an approach jump like this. We've only got the vertical vector.
Yes, no, that's a great thing, because when I went to a conference about a month ago where I met with my professor's professor, my grand professor, and essentially she told me this. She's like, the directions of motion, the directions of force application, that's what skill is. True skill in the movement is how an athlete is able to generate forces in specific directions at specific times relative to their body configuration. That's also something that the ultra sprint coaches are talking about. It's the directional forces really matter if you want to understand skilled movements. And you lose that if you only use the uniaxial force plates or those that only measure forces in the vertical direction. So those can only tell you broad general movement strategies rather than give you any insight into how an athlete might move in a skilled setting.
Yeah, I almost see the inverse in sprinting, since you mentioned Altus, where everyone's focused on the horizontal vector. And, we have to concede that a lot of the DRF calculations that we're using outside of like a 1080, which I think of as almost like a horizontal force plate, are estimated. And so we get
Yes.
so caught up on this horizontal force application that we miss how essential having like a minimum necessary vertical component is in sprinting. And I know this is kind of going down a different rabbit hole, but have you seen that problem? I don't know how much you're actually looking at sprinting.
To me, that's more of a Lance Brooks. Now at Bridgewater University. He does a lot more of the
Yeah.
sprinting, ground
And I
action
had
forces
Lance on
stuff.
before. He did a great podcast here.
Yeah, he shouted me out on another podcast, so I'm gonna shout him out here. He does a lot more with the forces, but basically, yes, you do need enough vertical force to again beat gravity to make sure you can stay off the ground and running. And I'm sure he probably went into the whole braking force debate. So to me, that's also a sign or really a symptom of not really understanding the action of the body versus directions of the forces. Braking impulse, when we are describing it in a research and physics sense, we're describing a direction. Braking meaning it goes against your current direction of motion.
Mm-hmm.
But we are obviously, no one's going to coach you to actively brake as a action, right? When we are sprinting, nobody's thinking, oh, I got to brake. Your body just does whatever is necessary to fulfill the task and ends up generating forces in a direction that aligns with the braking. And you needed to do that so you need to do that during the stride where you have initial contact, your foot is slightly in front of your center of mass. You're going to generate some braking force, and then you're going to generate some propulsive force. When you're at top speed, those impulses equal, you stay at the same speed. You don't have any net horizontal acceleration. So I kind of rambled a bit, but basically I wanted to highlight, there's differences between directions and the way we define and describe directions, braking, propulsive, versus the actions, where, action is something that athletes and coaches think about.
Mm-hmm.
But, directions is just what is directions relative to the movement of interest.
Yeah. So on that note, I want to go with the topic, the idea of force absorption. There are a handful of people who I think are kind of poo-pooing on this idea. Like, you can't absorb force, you can only produce force. But we have these braking components. So can you riff on that a little bit to maybe clarify the understanding that people aren't getting into these really rigid camps and how they're looking at things?
Oh, I forgot about force absorption. That should probably be the answer for one of my earlier questions. But I think the field swung back and forth a few ways. I can see where they're coming from. I'll say this. I can see where they're coming from. And technically, it is incorrect. But and also, I did offer in like one of my earlier posts way back. I did offer, I think, regulating momentum, braking your body's velocity, like deceleration. That could probably be a better term than force absorption.
Mm-hmm.
You're really absorbing your energy, absorbing and redirecting energy. Some people say, oh, convert to the heat, etc., etc. Heat and sound, really. When you land, you make a sound. So that's, I don't know. I sort of moved past the point of saying, oh, there's no force absorption. I see where you're coming from. As long as you don't, go ahead and teach and charge people for, for a membership or a seminar and then go talking about force absorption. It's a fine concept to explain to athletes, as long as you supplement with, you are braking against your current direction of travel. You're braking against your momentum. You're slowing down your momentum, right? Slowing down momentum, I think, is a easy enough concept for people to get behind. You want to slow down momentum in a gentle way, absorb force softly.
Mm-hmm.
You want to slow your momentum in an aggressive way, absorb force sharply.
Mm-hmm.
You can sort of like swap out these sort of phrases if you think it's a big enough problem when you use the phrase force absorption. And obviously, some biomechanists are gonna like scoff at the idea. Right now, I'm sort of more peaceful about it. It's technically incorrect, but also As long as you don't try to use it as an educational phrase, I don't care what you do with it.
Yeah. I have a clarifying question just because I'm going to start your villain arc. No. Um, we talk about the stretch shortening cycle as the storage and restitution of elastic energy. And you said maybe energy is an appropriate term while force absorption is not. So could you kind of, I know we're like really trying to sift and get into nuance here, but I'd love for you to just expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, I'll start with the force side. I'm a lot more comfortable with the force side. I might have misspoken with the energy side. I don't know.
I
Okay,
don't
but on the
either.
force side, the reason that you cannot really have force absorption is because forces are a quantity that's always transmitted and never quite gets lost. For
Okay.
example, if you push against a surface, the force transmits from the pushing side onto the surface itself. Even if you land, the totality of the forces are still being exerted,
Yep.
right? Even if you land softly, you still need to generate enough force to control your body's momentum. That's why I think when you talk about forces, you always have to tie it with momentum because your momentum dictates how much force you need to generate. If you
Mm-hmm.
want to absorb force in a gentle way, what you do that is you have the same amount of initial momentum and you're just increasing the time,
Mm-hmm.
thereby reducing the demand of force generation. Right? Force absorption is just really talking about a greater phenomena that includes force generation at different magnitudes and force generation durations at different lengths.
Okay.
Energy absorption, I know like people say, oh, energy is not neither destroyed or created, right, in a
Mm-hmm.
closed system. In most of human movements, when I say you absorb energy, it's because you come in with a certain amount of kinetic energy, and that energy just sort of goes away in the kinetic domain. You no longer have any kinetic energy left after you land. So that energy has to go somewhere, and it generally, goes into your body, goes into your muscles, and your muscle sort of takes on all of those kinetic energy by, doing work against it, by generating forces against your coming energy. So it might not be accurate to say it's absorbed. Maybe it's converted. Some of it's converted to heat.
Mm-hmm.
Some of it's converted to elastic energies in your lower limb as
Yep.
you stretch your ligaments and your muscles. Some of it's converted to sound. Nobody's going to ever do research on how much is which
Yeah.
because it's, what's the point? But that's the general idea. It might not have been the most accurate, but that's the general idea.
No, I think that's a really good clarifying point, just to understand, what we're talking about in a coherent and consistent way. Man, we've been going almost
Actually,
an hour. Go ahead.
there's something I do want to add to that. That's
Yes.
also why you should look at things from a momentum or mechanical based perspective. Because it's really, you're solving the problem of handling momentum.
Mm-hmm.
And when you view it from that lens, you're like, okay, we have these initial momentum that we want to deal with. We want
Yep.
to solve it in terms of we have this downward speed. We don't want that anymore. With that framing, you think about, okay, so what are the requirements for us to solve the problem? And it's to generate sufficient forces over sufficient time. So that sort of tells you, that's the requirement of force generation from the perspective of momentum. If you start with the momentum, things tend to make a bit more sense because momentum is what defines the task.
Yeah. No, I think that's phenomenal. And it kind of on that note, I was going to say we've been going almost an hour, and I do want to touch on baseball because you are a Marlin now, and you've got some research in this topic. So with kind of this impulse generation, I think the task of a basketball player is to overcome gravity so we can get airborne. The momentum and the force that we're trying to generate for, say, a pitcher is we're trying to put this into an object that is then going to become a projectile. So I guess when we're looking at, the differences that require this whole body impulse generation between, different legs, especially with 2-foot jumping, what are some of the similarities in how these athletes create and redirect momentum?
No, that's so fun. That's actually one of the things my dissertation committee asked me to add into my defense, which is a comparison of these two movements that I've done research for. So I sort of briefly describe, the context of momentum and force generation requirements in these two movements, and then sort of go from there.
Mm-hmm.
So in basketball jumping, you mentioned beating gravity. That's just one of the requirements. In a running jump, you also have to regulate your body's initial forward velocity. So
Okay.
regulate your body's forward momentum in addition to creating vertical momentum. And obviously maintain balance. Like balance maintenance is always an implicit requirement in the
Okay.
momentum domain. In baseball pitching, what's interesting is like the task objective, if you want to maximize ball speed, is to maximize ball momentum. So you do whatever movement pattern you need that helps you maximize ball momentum. And the strategies, within the constraint of the rules of baseball, because you can't run around with the baseball in your hand straight like a Rasengan in Naruto.
Yeah.
The strategy within the constraints of the sport is, people generate initial forward momentum of the body with the back leg. They break against that momentum aggressively with the front leg, and then they let their body rotate over it.
Mm-hmm.
So we can say it's beneficial, but not required. It's beneficial for athletes to generate whole body linear momentum, turn into a whole body angular momentum, and then transfer that momentum through the throwing hand into the ball. So in that sense, these are very different tasks with very different momentum regulation strategies by design. But the similarities between both is generally when you put your feet behind you, you're going to generate forward impulse or forward
Mm-hmm.
force. When you put your feet in front of you, you're going to generate backward force and backward momentum. So where that's similar between a running jump and a pitch is that if you want to generate forces to regulate or counter against your horizontal momentum, you need to make sure your limbs are in front of you. This is what happens when people talk about the plant angle when it comes to talking about jump technique. You want to make sure your legs are sufficiently in front of your body center of mass that allows you to generate a lot of backward forces.
Mm-hmm.
Another example of the consistency between your limb positioning around your body and force generation is in change of directions. If you want to move side to side very effectively, you want to make sure your legs are positioned far outside of your body's space, for lack of a better term. You want to position it laterally enough that allows it to generate lateral forces, because forces generally go through your limb as your hips, knees, and ankle exert against the ground. So by positioning your limbs in advantageous positions, you can generate the required forces easier. So those are the similarities I see from the mechanics perspective, but they are supposed to be very different.
Supposedly. So when it comes to strategy, especially in pitching, there's quite a bit of variance in like tall, slender pitchers. You're 6'3+, and then some of these shorter guys. What are some of the strategic differences in the way that they're creating this angular momentum through the ball?
So there are some general things, but I don't want to move away from fitting everybody into one mode versus fitting everybody into two modes, because to me,
Right.
that's just that's slightly better, but not that much better.
Yeah.
Generally, if you consider again, it's about maximizing the ball's linear momentum through space. Since the ball has a fixed mass, it's about maximizing the ball's linear velocity through space.
Mm-hmm.
A taller, longer athlete, to achieve that greater linear velocity, you don't have to rotate as fast because you have a longer lever to rotate through. So it could mean that, for shorter athletes, you need to generate greater rotational velocities, and that's what's going to help you reach higher linear velocity for your hand and your ball. But for longer athletes, you could afford to rotate a little bit less fast, as long as you make sure the linear velocity at the very end, aka your hand,
Mm-hmm.
is high enough. But I think it's too early to bucket people, because even as what we see from major league level baseball data, you're going to have people with very different looking physiques throwing all kinds of different ways. Different technique variables are going to click for different athletes, and it's very different between individuals, even though a coach without any better would be like, oh yeah, that's a pull and forward, that's a dip and drive. But the dip and drive can rely more on the rotational components of the trunk to throw fast, but you never know until you really dig into the data and really try to find those relationships. Otherwise, I think you're just sort of like you're just reaching for something in the muddy water and seeing what could work. And you have I'm gonna have lower confidence in that actually being the case.
Okay. Man, this was a lot. So I'm gonna hit you with a few kind of outro questions. That can be pretty short, or you can expand on them a little bit more if you want. But kind of shifting gears back to basketball, man. Who is your favorite dunker, or what is the dunk contest that everybody needs to YouTube?
Oh, I'm very basic with that. I love to me growing up because I'm a bit younger,
Yeah.
so I love the Zach Levine, Aaron Gordon. I think it's I don't remember which year it was, 2016 or something like that.
Okay.
The Aaron Gordon's first dunk contest where
Yeah.
he did the under both legs. Zach Levine just spammed behind between the legs for most of them. That's my favorite.
Okay.
My favorite dunker. Gosh, I don't really have any. I enjoy all the athletes that can dunk. In the dunk community, I do have a tendency to gravitate towards more power dunkers,
Okay.
people that take longer to get off the ground because that's just the kind of athlete that I am.
Okay.
I love jumps by Chi. I love Calvin dunks. Shout out to those Calvin Agron. They take their time. They take their sweet time getting off the ground, and that's the way I like to go in high jump.
How's your dunk game?
Oh, not great, not great. Currently, my buddy signed me up for more men's league that sort of goes in through the end of the year, and after that, I'm gonna have like some potential career changes. At that point, he's also gonna do his postdoc up in Cornell. So I'm gonna play more basketball in the short run. I've been dunking a lot more outside with those few dunking friends at Brooklyn Bridge Park. They have a low rim at 9.6. I
Yeah.
was chasing the windmill on a 9.6 all summer. I got really, really close a few times, but with all the travel with the Marlins job and this basketball thing, the dunk dream will take a backseat for a bit. I will still I'll get a few jumps in after the warm up before the game,
Yeah.
just to still micro dose, like the micro list of micro doses. But yeah, that will take a backseat in the foreseeable future. But that's okay because I'm in no rush to chase anything. That's
That's
sort
all
of the
right.
nice part. You can life happens and you just pick whatever you enjoy doing the most in the moment.
Yeah. Yeah. So what projects are in the pipeline? What are you excited for that's coming up?
Yeah, no, I actually have something to do, some work done with the NBA dunk score, where it's something they push out in the past year that reports a bunch of different biomechanical variables relating to jumping. I want to do a paper with that. Just kind of been procrastinating with the new job at the job search after my defense, but I do want to get that pushed out. I have a few collaborators that even got me some NBA combine data. So we can look at, your combine testing jump versus your in-game jump. And that could be pretty cool. With these kind of data, you're never going to be limited by sample size. So I have like 10,000 dunks
Oh
of
wow.
data that we could run different correlations analysis with. So that I'm really excited about that. But yeah, nothing too major. We have a few things in the docket that hopefully I'll announce like in a few months, maybe the start of the new year. But yeah.
Yep. Well, man, you get to enjoy a little time because I mean, I've done a master's defense and it was full throttle, so I can't even imagine what it was like doing a PhD and having the career change. So you probably deserve a little downtime.
I actually have my full defense. It's I my mindset then was like I'm only gonna do this once. I'm just gonna take my time. I also had I was actually sick, so I had to like take a drink of water like every 5 minutes. But that's all on my YouTube. So I guess I can just plug my stuff here, and you don't. So I'm just gonna plug it. My Instagram Sam underscore likes underscore biomechanics underscore
Good.
PhD. I did a PhD at the end after my defense. I think I thought about not doing it, but I think it's a funny bit. The name just sort of gets longer as I get more things.
Yeah.
That would be pretty hilarious. I also have a
Yeah.
YouTube where I put the longer form content explanations on. So that's again Sam likes biomechanics.
Yep.
And those are the two of my most used social media.
Okay. I'll make sure I link those. I did watch a good chunk of your defense, so
Hmm.
I got to finish it, and I plan to. So I'll make sure I link that. I'll make sure I link your Instagram, which seems to be the best place to find you.
Correct. Yeah. Honestly, don't feel bad. Like that thing, 1 hour 44 minutes. Like even my partner, she's not gonna watch the whole thing. So yeah, it's a whole movie.
It's all right. Just little bits and pieces. Well, man, I'm gonna let you go here. I want to be respectful of your time. I appreciate you coming
Thank you.
on. This was an awesome conversation. I know we kind of went in a lot of different directions and got in the weeds, but I think for anybody interested in jumping and just understanding, all the science behind it, I thought this was killer, man. You really kicked ass. So appreciate your knowledge and insight, and we'll definitely keep tabs on you so we can just kind of find what's new with your research.
Thank you very much.
If you enjoyed this episode, please remember to rate and review us with 5 stars only, then subscribe so you can get all the latest updates.